After a month of marriage, my wife denied me intimacy every night. When I confronted her, she said, "My body, my choice. You have no right." With cold eyes, I sat awake that night and made a decision that would change everything. The wedding had been perfect. Laughter, family blessings, photographs capturing promises of forever. I truly believed we were stepping into a new chapter of love, partnership, and intimacy. But the nights that followed told a completely different story. Every evening I reached for her, seeking closeness, connection, the natural intimacy that should flow between newlyweds. And every single night, she turned away. Sometimes she claimed exhaustion, sometimes illness. Sometimes she simply scrolled through her phone until she fell asleep. The blue glow more important than the man lying beside her. At first, I convinced myself this was normal. Marriage takes adjustment, I reasoned. We both needed time to settle into our new roles. But as days turned into weeks, my patience began rotting into confusion, then genuine pain. By the 30th night, something inside me had fundamentally shifted. "We've been married a month," I said, my voice soft, almost pleading. "You haven't touched me once. What's going on?" Her response wasn't hesitation or sorrow. It was a cold, dismissive blade. "My body, my choice. You have no right." The complete absence of warmth in her eyes made something inside me shatter. As she drifted off to sleep without another word, I lay staring at the ceiling, processing what had just happened. She hadn't just denied me physical intimacy. She had denied me respect, partnership, and basic human connection. In that silence, surrounded by the suffocating weight of her indifference, I made a choice. I wouldn't beg for affection or plead for the marriage I thought we'd agreed to build together. Instead, I would go to court and dissolve this union entirely. But what I didn't realize that night was how perfectly positioned I was to expose the real truth behind her calculated cruelty. What my wife didn't know was that I'd spent the last 8 years building a career in forensic accounting. I specialized in financial fraud investigations for divorce cases. My job required meticulous attention to detail, systematic documentation, and the ability to uncover financial deception that others missed. These weren't just professional skills, they were about to become the foundation of my personal strategy. My position at Blackstone Financial gave me access to resources most people couldn't imagine. I had relationships with the best family law attorneys in the state, investigators who specialized in digital forensics, and accountants who could trace financial irregularities that would be invisible to the average person. More importantly, I understood exactly how marriage dissolutions worked, what evidence carried weight in court, and how to build an unshakable case. Financially, I was in an exceptionally strong position. My annual salary of $180,000, combined with consulting fees that often pushed my yearly income above $220,000, meant I had both the resources to fund a thorough investigation and the independence to take time off if needed. I'd been conservative with my spending, maintaining an emergency fund of $85,000 that could easily cover 6 months of aggressive legal action. But there was something else, something that would prove far more valuable than money or professional connections. 3 weeks into our marriage, I'd noticed subtle changes in my wife's behavior. Late-night phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered rooms. A sudden interest in our financial accounts that felt more calculating than the curious. Her questions about my work projects had shifted from supportive to oddly specific, particularly about client confidentiality and asset protection. My forensic training had taught me to trust those instincts, so I'd begun what I privately called passive documentation. Nothing invasive or illegal, just careful attention to patterns that seemed inconsistent with the woman I thought I'd married. I'd started keeping receipts, noting dates and times of conversations, and yes, occasionally recording interactions when something felt particularly off. The most crucial advantage I possessed was understanding the legal framework of marital assets in our state. During our engagement, when we discussed the prenuptial agreement, I'd noticed several clauses that seemed unusually specific. At the time, I'd attributed them to thoroughness from her attorney. Now, with my professional expertise, I realized those clauses might tell a very different story about her intentions. I had one more strategic advantage that would prove decisive: patience. 8 years of forensic work had taught me that the most devastating cases are built slowly, methodically, with overwhelming evidence that leaves no room for dispute. I wasn't going to rush into emotional confrontations or hasty legal filings. I was going to build a case so comprehensive that the truth would be undeniable. The morning after her cold rejection, I began implementing what I privately called my strategic documentation protocol. Every conversation, every interaction, every financial transaction would be recorded and analyzed with the same systematic approach I use for my most complex fraud investigations. My first call was to Margaret Hale, the most respected family attorney in the state, and someone I'd worked with on multiple fraud cases. Margaret had seen every variation of marital deception and had a reputation for building unbreakable cases. Her consultation fee was $500 per hour, but her expertise was worth every dollar. "I need to understand all my options," I told her during our consultation. "But more importantly, I need to know what evidence would be most valuable if this heads to court." Margaret's advice was precise. Document everything, but do it legally. Focus on financial irregularities, communication patterns, and any evidence of deceptive intent. In cases involving potential fraud, the court pays attention to systematic patterns rather than isolated incidents. You'll need at least $15,000 for a comprehensive case if this goes to trial. My next step was implementing discrete monitoring of our joint financial accounts. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly what to look for: unusual transfers, undisclosed accounts, spending patterns that didn't match stated intentions. Within a week, I'd identified several transactions that raised immediate red flags. She'd transferred $3,200 to an account I'd never seen before, and there were regular payments of $800 monthly to something listed only as Personal Services LLC. I also began having what appeared to be casual conversations about our future plans, our financial goals, and our expectations for the marriage. But I was documenting everything, noting discrepancies between her stated intentions and her actual behavior, building a timeline that showed increasingly clear patterns of deception. The breakthrough came during a phone conversation I recorded while working late in my home office. She was in the next room, apparently believing I'd left for the gym, talking to someone she obviously trusted completely. "Don't worry about it," she said, her voice carrying a confidence I'd never heard when she spoke to me. "The rejection strategy is working perfectly. He's getting desperate, which means he'll be easier to manipulate when I start pushing for financial control. Once I have access to his accounts, this whole charade gets a lot easier." I sat frozen, listening to her laugh about what she called my body, my choice, being the perfect shield for her real intentions. She went on to describe specific financial assets she'd identified: my retirement account worth $340,000, the investment portfolio totaling $180,000, and even the $45,000 in my personal savings account that she somehow knew about, despite never having access to those statements. But the most damning moment came when she said, "I married him for security, not love. He's successful enough to give me the life I want, but stupid enough to think this is about romance. A few more weeks of keeping him off balance, and I'll have everything I need." That recording became the centerpiece of my evidence file, but I wasn't finished. I spent the following weeks building a comprehensive case that included financial records, communication logs, and documentation of her systematic deception. I consulted with digital forensics experts who helped me understand the legal requirements for submitting electronic evidence. Their services cost $2,800, but they confirmed the recording would be admissible in court. I also hired a private investigator, James Mitchell, who specialized in domestic cases. James's retainer was $5,000, but his job was to verify the information I'd gathered and identify any additional evidence that might strengthen my position. What he found exceeded my expectations. My wife had been maintaining a separate apartment under her maiden name, funded by money transferred from our joint account without my knowledge. The monthly rent was $1,400, and she'd been paying it for 3 months before our wedding even took place. She'd been meeting regularly with her own attorney, discussing strategies for maximizing her financial gain from our marriage. Most damaging of all, she'd been documenting our conversations and interactions, apparently building her own case for portraying me as controlling or abusive. "She's playing a long game," James explained during our final meeting. Everything she's doing suggests this was planned well before your marriage. The rejection, the emotional manipulation, even the specific language she uses. It's all designed to put you in a defensive position while she secures financial advantages. James had also discovered that she'd opened 3 credit cards in her name using our joint address, accumulating $18,000 in debt that she'd hidden from me. The purchases were telling: expensive clothes, jewelry, and what appeared to be furnishings for her secret apartment. The prenuptial agreement I'd signed suddenly made perfect sense. The clauses I'd thought were thorough legal protection were actually trapdoors she'd built into our marriage. But there was one clause that would prove to be her fatal mistake. Any party found to have entered the marriage under false pretenses or with intent to defraud would forfeit all claims to marital assets and become responsible for all legal costs incurred by the innocent party. At the time of our engagement, I'd insisted on that clause, thinking it protected both of us from potential future problems. I never imagined I'd be using it against my own wife. When I finally filed for dissolution, I wasn't seeking revenge or trying to punish her. I was simply presenting the court with systematic evidence of fraud that made our marriage legally invalid from the moment we'd signed the papers. The filing fee was $435, and Margaret's retainer for the case was $12,000. The courthouse hearing was everything I'd prepared for, and nothing like what she expected. She arrived in an expensive suit, one I now realized had been purchased with money from our joint account. She radiated the confidence of someone who believed she controlled the narrative. Her attorney clearly expected a straightforward dissolution with standard asset division. But when the judge asked why I was seeking dissolution so soon after marriage, her entire facade began cracking. "Your Honor," I said, standing with the calm confidence of someone who'd spent weeks building an unshakable case. I entered this marriage in good faith, believing my wife shared my commitment to building a genuine partnership. However, I've discovered systematic evidence that she entered our marriage with fraudulent intent. I presented the recordings, the financial evidence, the documentation of her separate living arrangements, and her communications about manipulating me for financial gain. Each piece of evidence built on the others, creating a picture of calculated deception that left no room for alternative interpretation. The moment that sealed her fate was when the judge listened to the recording of her admitting she'd married me for security rather than love, and describing her strategy for emotional manipulation. Her attorney tried to object, claiming the recording was obtained illegally, but Margaret was ready. "Your Honor, the recording was made in the plaintiff's own home, in a common area where both parties had equal access. Under state law, this constitutes legal evidence of fraudulent intent. This court finds clear evidence of fraudulent intent," the judge declared. "The marriage is dissolved, and pursuant to the prenuptial agreement's fraud clause, the respondent forfeits all claims to marital assets and is responsible for all legal costs incurred by the plaintiff." The financial impact was immediate and devastating for her. She was ordered to pay my legal costs, which totaled $19,300 by the end of the proceedings. The secret apartment lease was in her name, making her responsible for the remaining $8,400 in rent payments. The $18,000 in credit card debt she'd hidden became her sole responsibility. But the legal victory was just the beginning of her consequences. The court records became public, and word spread quickly through our professional and social circles. Her employer, Meridian Consulting, a mid-sized firm that prized reputation above everything else, began quietly limiting her responsibilities and excluding her from client-facing roles. Within 2 months, her position was restructured, effectively demoting her from senior consultant to junior analyst, cutting her salary from $75,000 to $48,000 annually. Her family, who had been so proud of her successful marriage, found themselves fielding uncomfortable questions about their daughter's behavior. Her parents, Robert and Linda, had bragged to their entire social circle about their daughter landing such a successful husband. When the truth came out, several relatives cut contact entirely, unwilling to be associated with someone who'd been exposed for such calculated deception. Her sister Emma, who had served as maid of honor at our wedding, publicly distanced herself from the situation. "I had no idea what she was planning," Emma told mutual friends. "This isn't the person I thought I knew." The apartment she'd been maintaining in secret became unsustainable once she lost access to our joint accounts and faced the reduced income from her demotion. She was forced to break the lease early, incurring an additional $2,800 penalty. Her own attorney, David Brennan, distanced himself from the case once the recordings revealed she'd lied to him about her intentions and actions. He filed a motion to withdraw from representation, citing client dishonesty that compromised his ability to provide effective counsel. Most devastating of all, her reputation in our small professional community was permanently damaged. The story of her fraudulent marriage spread quickly through industry networks, making it impossible for her to maintain the social connections she'd worked years to build. 3 clients specifically requested she be removed from their accounts, citing concerns about her character and judgment. 6 months after the dissolution, I encountered her at Riverside Bistro, where I was having a business dinner with potential clients. She looked completely different, exhausted, defeated, isolated. When she approached my table, her confidence had been replaced by desperate pleading. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Can we talk? I've lost everything. My family won't speak to me. My friends have all cut me off. At work, they treat me like I don't exist." I looked at her calmly and replied, "You told me, my body, my choice. You have no right. You were correct. You made your choice, and now you're living with the consequences of that decision." As I walked away from that restaurant, I felt no anger or satisfaction, just clarity. She had wanted to manipulate me into a marriage of convenience, using emotional cruelty to maintain control while extracting maximum financial benefit. But her fundamental mistake was underestimating both my professional capabilities and my personal integrity. The dissolution hadn't just freed me from her deception, it had revealed the strength that comes from systematic preparation, professional competence, and refusing to accept treatment that violates basic human dignity. She'd tried to use the law as a weapon against me, but ended up destroying herself with the very trap she'd built into our marriage. A year later, I'd built a more successful practice, with my client base growing by 40% as word spread about my meticulous approach to complex cases. My annual income had increased to $260,000, and I'd developed stronger relationships with colleagues who respected my handling of the situation. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my instincts about people's character and the value of thorough documentation. She remained isolated, struggling professionally, and facing the long-term consequences of choices that had seemed so clever when she was making them. James Mitchell, who maintained contacts throughout the industry, reported that she'd been forced to take a position at a smaller firm for $38,000 annually, less than half her original salary. The financial strain of legal costs, broken leases, and credit card debt had forced her to move back in with her parents at age 32. Her parents, Robert and Linda, had initially tried to support her, but the constant financial requests and social embarrassment eventually strained those relationships as well. Robert, a retired bank manager who valued financial responsibility above all else, struggled to understand how his daughter had made such catastrophically poor decisions. Emma, her sister, had completely cut contact after learning that my ex-wife had asked her to lie to investigators about the timeline of the secret apartment. She wanted me to commit perjury to cover for her fraud. Emma told mutual friends, "I can't be associated with someone who would ask that of family." The recordings that exposed her fraud had been perfectly legal under our state's single-party consent laws. The evidence I'd gathered was comprehensive and unshakable, including financial records showing $23,400 in fraudulent transfers, documented lies to her own attorney, and systematic deception spanning months before and after our wedding. Most importantly, every action I'd taken was designed to reveal the truth rather than inflict punishment. She'd defeated herself through her own documented words and systematic deception. The prenuptial agreement she'd crafted to trap me had become the legal mechanism of her own downfall. Margaret Hale later told me it was one of the most clear-cut fraud cases she'd handled in 20 years of practice. "Your documentation was so thorough that her attorney had no choice but to advise her to accept the judgment," she explained. "Fighting it would have only increased her legal costs with no chance of success." The total financial impact on her was staggering. $9,300 in legal costs she was ordered to pay, $18,000 in credit card debt that became her sole responsibility, $8,400 in remaining apartment lease obligations, $2,800 in early termination penalties, and the loss of approximately $27,000 in annual income due to her career damage. The grand total exceeded $75,000 in direct costs, not including the long-term impact on her earning potential. In contrast, my strategic approach had not only protected my assets, but actually improved my financial position. The legal costs I'd incurred were fully reimbursed through the court judgment, and my reputation for thorough, methodical work had attracted new clients who valued those qualities. My investment in professional documentation and legal counsel had paid dividends far beyond the immediate case. In the end, she'd denied me love, respect, and basic marital partnership, while attempting to defraud me of financial security I'd worked years to build. Life had responded by denying her the security, reputation, and social standing she thought she'd secured through calculated manipulation. The justice was perfect precisely because it was entirely self-inflicted. Every consequence flowed directly from choices she'd made and documented in her own words. The lesson was clear. When someone shows you who they really are through their actions, believe them. And when they try to use manipulation and deception to control your life, sometimes the most strategic response is to let their own documented behavior speak for itself in a court of law.